We all make promises, but what's the difference between a casual, I'll be there to a friend, and a legally binding pact that could actually land you in court? Well, today we're going to dive into the Indian Contract Act of 1872 to figure that out.
So, think about this for a second. You probably make dozens of little agreements every week. You tell a friend you'll meet up for a movie, but then something comes up and you have to bail. They can't sue you, right? It's no big deal. But if you sign a lease for an apartment and don't pay the rent, that's a whole different story. You're definitely in trouble. So what's the real difference? That's exactly what we're going to get to the bottom of.
And the answer, believe it or not, is right here, in this simple but really powerful definition from the law itself. A contract is just an agreement that's enforceable by law. Those are the magic words, enforceable by law. That's the bright line that separates a friendly promise from a serious legal obligation.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, we'll look at the 2 core ingredients of any contract. Then we'll get into what I'm calling the 10-point contract recipe, the stuff that makes it legit. After that, we'll explore a contract's legal status, and we'll wrap things up by looking at all the different ways contracts are made.
Okay, let's start with the absolute basics. Every single contract, no matter how big or small, is built on 2 fundamental blocks. You have to have both. It's kind of like baking. You need both flour and water to make dough. If you're missing one, the whole thing just falls apart.
So an agreement plus legal enforceability is what gives you a contract. And this brings us to a super important rule of thumb. All contracts are agreements, but, and this is the part to remember, not all agreements are contracts. The key difference, the thing that turns a simple agreement into a full-blown contract, is that it creates a legal obligation. Okay, so that raises the big question, right? How does a regular agreement get that magic ingredient of enforceability? Well, it turns out there's a specific recipe, a checklist laid out in the law. Let's take a look at the essential elements that can turn a simple agreement into a rock-solid, valid contract.
So here are some of the big ones, straight from Section 10 of the Act. You've got the basic agreement, sure, but you also need stuff like an intention to create legal relations, free consent, the capacity of the people involved, a whole bunch of things. We're going to focus on that intention piece first, because it's super important. And this idea of intention is fascinating because the law basically makes a guess depending on the situation. If you're making a deal with a friend or your spouse, a social or domestic thing, the law's starting point is, nah, you probably didn't mean for this to be a legal thing. But the moment you step into a business or commercial setting, whoa, the tables turn completely. The assumption is, of course, this is meant to be legally binding.
This whole idea was really locked in by a famous old case, Balfour versus Balfour. Here's what happened. A husband was working overseas and promised his wife a monthly allowance. Well, he stopped paying and she took him to court. But the court basically said, look, promises you make to each other as husband and wife, that's not the kind of thing we enforce in court.
But hey, it's not just about intention. There are other key ingredients, like consent has to be free. I mean, you can't be forced into a contract at gunpoint, right? The people making the deal must have capacity. They need to be adults of sound mind. Then there's something called lawful consideration, which is just a fancy legal term for the what's in it for me, the exchange of value. And finally, the terms have to be certain. You can't just agree to sell 100 tons of oil. What kind of oil? For how much? The details have to be clear.
Okay, so we've got our recipe. But what happens if you forget an ingredient or one of them is, well, off? It turns out it's not a simple yes, it's a contract, or no, it's not. Things can get a little more complicated. A contract can have different legal statuses. It could be valid, void, or even something in between. And one of the most interesting categories is the voidable contract. Get this, it's a perfectly good contract, but one person holds all the cards. They have the power, the option, to just cancel the whole thing. This usually comes up when someone was tricked or pressured into signing. The person who was wronged gets to make the call, stick with the deal, or walk away. So let's really nail down the difference here. A void contract is basically a non-starter. It's a dead end. No rights, no obligations, nothing. For instance, if you had a contract to do something and a new law suddenly makes it illegal, poof, that contract is now void. But a voidable contract is totally different. It's still alive, it can be performed. The key is that one person has the escape hatch. They can choose to enforce it, or they can choose to hit the eject button. And if you want to get really specific, and lawyers love to be specific, there's even a difference between a void agreement and a void contract. A void agreement was dead on arrival. It was never valid, not for a second. The classic example is any agreement made with a minor. But a void contract? That's a different story. It started out perfectly fine, totally valid, but then something happened down the line that made it unenforceable.
And the last big distinction we need to make is between void and illegal. Now, here's the rule. All illegal agreements are void, but not all void agreements are illegal. The real difference is the fallout. An illegal agreement, say a contract to commit a crime, can land you in actual trouble with punishments. And here's the kicker. It poisons everything around it. So if you lend money to your buddy knowing he's going to use it for that illegal deal, guess what? You can't legally get your money back. The whole chain of transactions is tainted.
All right, we're in the home stretch. For our last section, let's talk about how contracts are actually made and performed. Because, it's not always about sitting down and signing a 50-page document.
So sometimes a contract is express. It's spelled out in words, either spoken or written. And yep, that totally includes e-contracts. But other times it's implied. Your actions speak louder than words. Think about hopping on a public bus. You didn't sign anything, but by getting on, you've made an implied promise to pay the fare. And then there's this weird category called a quasi-contract, which, well, it's not really a contract at all. It's more like the law stepping in to ensure fairness and prevent one person from unjustly benefiting at another's expense.
We can also categorize contracts based on where they are in their life cycle. Is the deal done? If yes, it's an executed contract, mission accomplished for both sides. If things are still in motion, it's executory. Then you can ask, what's being exchanged? In a bilateral contract, it's a two-way street, a promise for a promise. But in a unilateral contract, it's a promise in exchange for an act. The classic example is a lost dog poster. The owner is promising a reward, but the contract only kicks in when someone actually performs the act of finding and returning the dog.
So here's a final thought for you. The next time you're browsing a website and you come across that little checkbox, you know the one, I have read and agreed to the terms and conditions, maybe just pause for a half second. Because that click, that's you. That's your signature. You are accepting an offer and potentially entering into a legally binding contract. It's amazing, really. A 150-year-old law playing out every single day with just the click of a mouse. Something to think about.